As the Second World War drew to a close, the United States, under Harry S. Truman, began to call for the decolonization of the European powers. Given the destruction of the war and the ravaging of the economies of the world, coupled with the fact that the Americans were subsidizing the rebuilding efforts in Europe to many colonial powers, this decolonization was inevitable already. The Marshall Plan slowly rebuilt the economies of Western Europe as the Soviet Union expanded its domain in the East. The British found themselves in a particularly tight spot, given the sheer size and scale of their centuries-long empire. Historically, their dominions were a great economic benefit and lifted the British to superpower status on the world stage. But in the wake of the turmoil of the Second World War, the British colonies were in disarray and were quickly becoming an economic drain rather than a benefit to the British. Thus, with pressure from the Americans and the promise of low-risk loans to rebuild, the British, along with other powers of Europe, decolonized. But what if this had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the British Empire never decolonized? Despite mounting pressure from international allies and independence movements within its colonies, the British stubbornly clung to their imperial possessions. Facing economic hardships and growing internal dissent, the government of the United Kingdom descended into a form of semi-isolationism, prioritizing domestic recovery over global intervention. The once dominant British Empire withdrew from its role as a global superpower, focusing instead on crafting a plan to retain control over its colonies and repair its economy. Ironically, British politicians would begin to nationalize certain industries, not unlike the Italian fascists had done once they took power prior to the war. Industry puttered to a start, and the British attempted to reopen their domestic markets in India and South Africa. As the dust of the Second World War settled on the deserts and mountains of Central Asia and the Middle East, the omnipresent Soviet Union embarked on a campaign to spread its influence and extend its reach into the heart of the region. In Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan, the Soviets provided financial aid, arms shipments, and ideological guidance to communist factions and leftist parties, aiming to establish sympathetic regimes aligned with their interests. But the greatest challenge to Soviet ambitions lay in Iran, a nation strategically positioned at the crossroads of the Middle East and Central Asian Soviets. Desperately seeking access to the vital Persian Gulf and the lucrative oil reserves that lay beyond, the Soviets faced fierce resistance from Iran's proud and defiant leaders and defenders. As tensions simmered, Soviet leaders knew they needed a subtler approach, a way to exert their influence and push southward without resorting to open warfare. In the hazy heat of a Delhi afternoon, the halls of power buzzed with tension as leaders deliberated over the fate of a nation on the brink of independence. India, long shackled by the chains of colonial rule, stood at the precipice of history, ready to cast off the yoke of British imperialism and forge its own path forward. Within the ornate chambers of the Indian National Congress, delegates debated the future of the subcontinent. India's bid for independence gained unexpected support from an unlikely ally, the Soviet Union. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Delhi, the Indian leadership made a fateful decision. A small meeting of members in the Congress unfolded under a veil of secrecy. Gathered in hushed tones, a select group of influential members deliberated over a plan that would shape the fate of the subcontinent. Around the ornate table, the assembled leaders nodded in silent agreement, their faces drawn with determination. With a solemn nod at the head of the table, one member of the Congress signaled to a trusted aide, who produced a series of maps detailing strategic locations along India's northern frontier. A covert army was to be created, trained, and armed. Stationed south of Nepal and in the Kashmir region, the force would serve to march to Delhi and declare the independence of India. The congressmen exchanged wary glances and murmurs, fully aware of the risks involved in such a bold undertaking. Yet they also understood the gravity of the situation and the necessity of a free India for their people, for their children, and for their futures. They would accept the covert offers sent by the Soviets and use Soviet funds and arms to overthrow the British colonizers. Within months, the army was somewhat trained and somewhat armed. The time was right. Britain was still in recovery and India was facing the ramifications. In a bold move, India declared its independence with the full backing of the Soviet Union. But the game was far from over. Indian troops marched into Delhi and defended the National Congress. They were bolstered by Indian and Sikh defectors from the British military, who grew displeased by their treatment under the British military system following World War II. Skirmishes even broke out within the halls of the National Congress, as loyalists attempted to flee. In London, the House of Commons saw the writing on the wall. There would be no victory over India this time. The British ordered their troops to cease all operations against the growing nationalist Indian army. In return for formal recognition, the British forces and British citizens would be allowed to exit unhindered and return to the Isles. Finally, India was free. As the final columns of British soldiers and loyalists left, the newly independent Indian National Congress now faced a plethora of new challenges, not least of which how to govern their new massive country, but also what side to align themselves in the unfolding Cold War. Vallabhbhai Patel, the Iron Man of India, stood at the helm of the congressional meeting, his gaze fixed upon the path ahead. By his side, Jawaharlal Nehru, the eloquent architect of India's democracy. The Congress was divided, torn between conflicting visions of India's role on the world stage. On one side stood those advocating for isolationism, for an India that was concerned only with itself, led by Patel, who believed in an India without external influence. Opposing them were voices calling for alignment with the Soviet world order, led by Manvindranath Roy and Abhinav Mukherjee. They argued that India must forge a concrete alliance with the Soviet Union, who funded their revolution. As debate ran on across the globe, the empire from which India separated was now weaker than ever. The British were left in disarray. The cost of rebuilding their own country, France, West Germany, and their colonies was simply too much to bear, especially without the goodwill of the Americans, who refused unconditional aid to the imperial power. Without the help of the British, however, the Americans and their European partners found themselves in a more desperate situation. There simply weren't enough eyes and boots on the ground to prevent the inevitable. The Iron Curtain pushed westward. Across Europe and the Middle East, the Soviets funded revolutions and communist parties. In Sicily, a revolt broke out against the democratic Italian government by the impoverished peoples of the South. With the backing of the Soviets, communists declared a communist state on the island and prepared to fight for independence from the American puppet state in the north. In Greece, tensions between communist insurgents and the government escalated into a full-blown civil war, with the Soviets providing support to communist factions in their struggle against Western-backed forces. In the hallowed rooms of the British Parliament, a somber atmosphere hung heavy as MPs grappled with the state of the fractured world. The specter of communism loomed large on the continent, casting a red shadow which reached towards the empire's shores. Debates raged on, impassioned speeches echoing off the chamber walls. Amidst the cacophony of voices, a consensus began to emerge, a bold vision for the future of the British Empire. There was no way out of this mess that would leave Britain economically safe, but there was a way to protect her from disillusion. Recognizing the need for a united front against the rising tide of communism, the British Parliament resolved to form the Commonwealth of Nations. From the bustling streets of London to the ports of Hong Kong and Singapore to the arid fields of the Cape Colony and Rhodesia, across all the far-flung corners of the empire, the news was a shock. The effort to reorganize a global empire would not be easy, but it might just preserve the integrity of the British economy. In London, the former governors of the British colonies, now the newly appointed leaders of the nations of the Commonwealth, gathered in the grand halls of Westminster for a historic summit. They stood, united in their resolve to confront the looming threat of communism and safeguard the economies of their states from implosion. With public opinion in the British Isles turning against communism on the continent, the Americans and what remained of the European nations who rejected communist advances forged a powerful alliance, pooling their resources and coordinating their efforts to combat communist expansionism in Europe and the Middle East. American aid finally relieved the British, preventing economic doom. Production was domesticated in the African members of the Commonwealth, and in the Pacific, Malaysia and Hong Kong aligned themselves with the growing alliance of anti-communist nations propped up by the United States. The British-occupied zone of Germany was reunited with the American and French zones, and the Republic of West Germany was established. In Italy, the British Navy helped to defend against communist aggression in Sicily. In India, the government was forced to turn inwards and ignore Soviet pressures as revolution broke out in the north by a rebelling Muslim population. The Middle Eastern members of the Commonwealth began a campaign to reverse the gains of the Soviets in the region and encircle the communists. The post-war world was a multipolar one, a world whose economy and peace teetered on the brink. Perhaps the British were mistaken in trying to cling to their once great empire, but such a question would have to wait. For the sun may have set over London, but it had not yet set over the Commonwealth of Nations. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have new videos like this one every week, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. A special thanks to everyone who has donated to us on Patreon and through channel memberships on the main channel. Support from our patrons and donors helps make regular videos possible, and every donation goes a long way to keeping our channels going. If you can't donate anything, please consider subscribing on here and on our main channel and sharing this video to help out. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Mr. Z out.